Okay, so first, really excited to welcome Brandon Bretl, who's an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Tyler. So his research covers two primary areas. On the one hand, he looks at developmental theories of intuitive judgments, while his other research looks at the link between latent psychological factors of learning and behavioral outcomes. So interestingly, before completing his PhD, Brandon began his teaching career teaching English abroad, including in Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. He earned his PhD in 2020 from the University of Kansas, looking at the structure of moral intuitions in early adolescence. Following this, he worked as a visiting assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin, Eau Claire, until 2021, where he's now in his current position at the University of Texas, Tyler. Brandon has very strong funding and publication record with papers in outlets like Trends in Psychology, Cognitive Development, Evolutionary Human Sciences, including many single-authored publications, which is particularly impressive. He's presented his work at a range of international conferences, including SPSP, again, link to the Moral Psychology Pre-Conference, which you should all consider applying to. And we've been particularly interested in Brandon's approach and his findings, and we're delighted to introduce him today, where he's going to be speaking about addressing implicit gender biases in moral judgments via neurolinguistic word order paradigms. So thank you so much for being here, Brandon. And if you'd like to start sharing your screen, take it away. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much, Jim. Special thanks to Jim, Killian, and Meltem for putting this on. It's a great opportunity here. And looking forward to sharing my work. So let's see. Okay, how does that look for everybody? Good. All right. So we'll get right into it. I'll go relatively quickly through some of the past stuff that I did that led to the current stuff. I think it's important for the background information, but just know I'm going to go through it pretty quickly, mainly just if something there does interest you, it'll give you an opportunity to look it up later, but just give you some background before we get into what I'm doing currently. So first, we'll look at the moral foundations theory stuff that I did in adolescent development contexts. And then we'll do the neurolinguistics and implicit bias research that I'm currently engaged in, and then some future directions. So we move this. What I'm working with currently is I'm trying to reconcile these different theories. So there's this study published in 2016 that looked at social domain theory and moral foundations theory, and they really showed that social domain theory is best thought of as a theory of the features of moral violations. So, for example, intrinsic harmfulness or unfair or unfairness. And moral foundations theory is really best thought of as a theory of individual differences in types of acts categorized as moral violations. So, for example, disrespect for authority, where some people might not consider disrespect for authority as a moral violation. And this really ties into Killian's work with moral judgment as categorization theory. That's really the best way to think about moral foundations theory then. So briefly, the instrument that I've been primarily using is this series of moral violation vignettes. I call it the Character Foundation Survey. It helps get it into schools and things like that. And it's based off of a series of vignettes created by Clifford et al. In 2016. So you see some examples here. 9 factors, 6 items in each factor. There's a norm violation factor just for validation purposes. And everything's rated on a 5-point scale from not bad to extremely bad. And this is some real early work I did with it, just some exploratory factor analysis with adult participants. It works out really well in line with moral foundations theory. When I do that with adolescent participants, we see sort of this mix of social domain theory and moral foundations theory stuff come up. So here's a group of various moral foundations theory factors in this first factor from this exploratory factor analysis. What they share in common is really just this abstract rule-based violations. and arguably culpable victims. So for example, this first one here, a girl laughing at another student for getting her lines at a school play. Arguably, the girl forgot her lines. Whereas compare that to factor 3 here, teenage boy laughing at another boy with a disability. Obviously, there's no culpability there for the victim. So we have clearly innocent victim, obvious harm that's easy to empathize with. So the idea is that in children, this is the kind of the rough categories that they're judging stuff and placing it in, and then but we start to see these other factors start to come out and develop in adolescence, so that animal physical, autonomy, and loyalty. So I did a little bit of research based on that, working on this 3-factor model with animal physical as sort of a proxy for empathy, and then looking at autonomy and loyalty as these already established categories of moral violations that are going to influence ratings of wrongness. And that's interesting from an adolescent development perspective, because really that's what adolescence is all about. It's that, developing autonomy from our caregivers, but then at the same time, there's the balancing of loyalty to other obligations and friends and things like that that has to happen. We looked at some latent factor mean comparisons to show that in early adolescence, boys and girls are developing these latent factors differently. So 11 and 12-year-old girls are higher in all 3 of these than the 11, 12-year-old boys. When we compare the 13 and 14-year-old girls to 11 and 12-year-old girls, no change in the animal physical, but they decrease in autonomy and loyalty latent factors. So then when we compare 13 and 14-year-old girls, 13 and 14-year-old males, we see that there's no difference in that loyalty factor. They're still higher in the animal physical. They decreased a bit in the autonomy, but they're still higher in the autonomy as well. And then looking a little bit at, this was a study published in Trends in Psychology, looking at gender and political identity influence, and actually sex of the participant as well. So this was just one interesting finding from that. This is a table of the variance explained by sex after controlling for school, because these students came from different schools. I did a political ideology construct or a political identity construct based on a couple different, asking if they're liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat, things like that. So what's interesting here is if they don't know, obviously most early adolescents don't have any political affiliation. So if they don't know, it's somewhat consistent with a conservative identity. These were students in Kansas, so rural conservative communities mainly. And what's really interesting, though, is that here with that conservative ID construct, something like this, human physical violations, more than 10% of the variance is explained by sex if they identify as conservative. And that's all of them have some sort of variance explained by sex if they identify as conservative. But if they identify as liberal, nothing. There are no, and the way the way I interpreted that is a sort of internalization of gender stereotypes that they're using in making these moral judgments, whereas that whatever's happening in their life that would make them say that they identify as liberal, it's also protecting them from internalizing those stereotypes that they'd use in making moral judgments. Okay, so now to the latest stuff here with the neurolinguistics, implicit bias research. So in doing this initial research, I came across this interesting thing with the stats through the factor analysis. I had modification indices for these 2 items. So I just had to look at all these items and say, okay, what is different about these 2 items that's making them not consistent with the others? So I thought maybe it has something to do with gender. And then I saw, well, these down here also have gender information, but they're not part of that group for modification indices. So I went down a rabbit hole of neurolinguistics research on gender priming and all of that stuff. And I published the findings of that. So I didn't pre-register the study, but it's sort of pre-registered through publication of this review paper in the Journal of Psychology. So I lay out very clearly the theoretical theoretical basis for why I think this would be in that paper. And then I finally, the week that Killian actually contacted me to talk about this, I had just analyzed the data from the first run of this. So So here's the general idea. This is some previous research in neurolinguistics, Cassiari, 2007. They were looking at sort of gendered nouns, nouns that are stereotypically one gender. So for example, mechanic. And they found that there was, and this was a priming effect on a subsequent pronoun to see if there were priming effects. And if they did a 200 millisecond stimulus followed by a 100 millisecond interval, there was no priming effect. They did a 300 millisecond stimulus followed by a 200 millisecond interval, there was a priming effect. So you're looking at a difference of 200 milliseconds, 500 milliseconds to get there. And this is consistent with another study that theorized gender stereotype activation at about 475 milliseconds. So this is the model that I proposed for this. You have a text-based stimulus. You have categorization that's happening at about 195 milliseconds, stereotype activation at about 475 milliseconds, and then any influence of that stereotype activation is going to happen after that 475 milliseconds, which is about half a second. 500 milliseconds is half a second. So going back to those text-based vignettes, I chose two that I thought would be contrasting in terms of the stereotypes that would be held about them. So in America, at least, we tend to have stereotypes and implicit biases about girls disrespecting authority. So for whatever reason, that's especially offensive when girls disrespect authority. When it comes to justice, it doesn't really matter if it's a boy or a girl. Injustice is an injustice. If it's unfair, it's unfair. So these are examples of violations in each of those vignettes. You see a teenage girl coming home late and ignoring her parents' rules, and you see a boy skipping to the front of the line because of his friend's an employee. So what I did, I created these 4 experimental conditions, and I wanted to test this without having to do any EEG or ERP research actually. I wanted to see if this could be done just with like a large N survey-based instrument, see if anything came out. And these are the 4 conditions. So condition 1, you see a girl, her, and in red here is the first time that the gender information is presented in the sentence. And then condition 2 here, you see a student, her, you see a boy, his, and then you see a student. Oops, excuse me. And just to make sure it's clear, these are what those 4 conditions would look like. When participants logged onto the survey, they took all 54 items of the survey, but only the authority and justice violations were modified to be in one of these 4 conditions. So they were assigned to a single condition where all the authority violations were either one of these and all the justice violations were one of these conditions. And I was actually shocked that it worked. I did all the work putting, going in and looking into theory, but when it actually came out like this, I was like, I can't believe it. Like I didn't actually expect this to work. It came out very, very clean as well. And what we're looking at here, so here are the violation types, authority and justice. These are the conditions compared. And then these are the 2 significant differences between mean ratings. And I split Republicans and Democrats because the idea was that Republicans would hold these implicit biases related to authority violations and Democrats would not. So the surprise then was finding a difference between conditions 1 and 3, which are the explicit conditions of girl and boy. So in the implicit condition here, 1 and 2, there was a difference between Republicans. In the explicit conditions here, there was a difference between Democrats. So to clarify that, so Republican authority violations, difference in condition here. And then Democrat authority violations, there was a difference between these 2 conditions. So based on that, all of that is consistent with the hypothesized time course for stereotype activation and the influence on moral judgments. It's consistent with the hypothesized implicit biases held by group members. A few other things to consider. So the gender neutral introductions are important. And that's because implicit biases are not mutually exclusive. So one other interesting finding is where we don't see statistically significant differences. So for Republicans, we see them in the implicit condition, but when comparing explicitly, you see a boy or you see a girl, we don't see a difference there. So what that's telling me is just that implicit biases, they're not mutually exclusive. So just because you have an implicit bias about men doesn't mean you also don't have implicit biases about women. Or there's subgroups within Republicans that are, have different implicit biases and hold different stereotypes. And then the result with the Democrats, the way I could explain that would be overcorrection bias. So there is this awareness of implicit bias related to gender, and we see this in the opposite direction compared to the Republicans. So here the Republicans are rating, when they have the female gender information at the beginning of the sentence, they're rating those as worse. And here Democrats are rating the explicit male conditions as worse. So the idea here would be, again, this is one way of interpreting it, is a possible overcorrection bias in Democrats because they're aware of those implicit stereotypes. Some limitations, mostly youth protagonists in the vignettes. This was all done with adults, but I do mostly research with adolescents. They were controlled between conditions, so it wasn't like the different conditions had different ages, but there might be a difference if we look at implicit biases against adults compared to youth. And then major limitation, no ERP data collected. So no EEG, no neuro data collected actually. So future, can use this paradigm, look at other stereotypes and implicit biases, age and race and other stereotypes, can look at this in developmental context. I'm looking to create some more precise methods outside of EEG experiments. So again, some large N studies. They took this survey just like they would take any other survey. They got a random, 9 vignettes per screen. But I was thinking of changing it, doing some experimental conditions where we do it word by word, kind of mimic more closely an EEG or ERP study, without actually doing it. And then of course, eventually doing some EEG and ERP studies with this stuff as well. And I think that's it. Happy to take questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Brandon. And yes,